Hello and welcome back to the Digital Culture Speaker Series. Glad to have you with us. Today with us, glad to have with us as well, is Thomas Seager. Dr. Thomas Seager is an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment. Tom, please take it away.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for having me here to talk about wicked problems and what we can do about them. For me, it's been a decadal series of relations that got me interested in complex systems as they relate to the environment, and wicked problems as a way of thinking about environmental problems of sustainability and grappling with them. So I want to introduce you in a personal way to wicked problems by talking about the environmental problems as they've evolved over the course of my life. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was born in the 60s, and the reputation that Pittsburgh had at that time is exemplified from this earlier photograph. This is Donora, Pennsylvania. It's a steel town, most famous for being the birthplace of Stan Musial and Ken Griffey Jr. in photographs like this, because this is taken at noon. If it reminds you a little bit of the pictures that we're seeing from San Francisco and California, Donora was worse. This isn't a wildfire, this is smoke from the steel mills and the coke ovens. In 1943, we were in the throes of World War II, and the thing about the smokestacks is people equated the pollution with economic prosperity and gave it a higher purpose, such as the war effort. So it wasn't that people enjoyed the pollution, it was that they understood the pollution as a compromise that they made because of other things that they wanted, whether it was victory in the war or economic prosperity brought on by the insecurity of the Depression. But by the time I went to school, Pittsburgh looked more like this. I was committed to a career in environmental engineering, and I was starting my education at Clarkson University in 1983. And by then, almost all the steel mills and the coke ovens in Pittsburgh had been shut down. The air miraculously cleared up. So the city, with the reputation for being hell with the lid off, was actually quite beautiful in its topography and its built environment. And people understood between the pollution-worn city that I was born in and the city that I left when I went away to school, that the environment was not just a repository for waste that we used as an excuse to achieve other goals, but the environment was part of a larger system that contributed to our quality of life. I want to take you through that transition. Here's me right before the Arab oil crisis of 1973, the inflation that it brought on, and the first economic crisis in Pittsburgh that resulted in massive layoffs throughout the steel industry. You can see what I look like now via the video. There was something important in the generation that came of age, the baby boomers, that came of age in the late 60s and the early 70s. It was a political and cultural movement that began to express a new environmental ethic. One of the most famous salient images here is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland on fire. Earth Day was partly a response to those images of the river that is so polluted it can catch fire. But the fact is, the Cuyahoga River had been on fire every once in a while for decades before, I think it was 1968 or 9, when the famous photographs came out. Earth Day was an expression of this political and cultural movement that began to change the perception of the environment. Environmental problems at the time were part of our sensory experience. They were immediate, they were urgent, we could touch them, smell them, breathe them, and have sensory contact with them. But it wasn't much longer before this concept of hazardous waste emerged. And Love Canal, New York exemplifies it. It was a 60-minute special that made Love Canal a popular word, and the predicament of the students and the people in the neighborhood of the school that had been over a toxic waste dump, it become part of the national consciousness. What we see before Love Canal was environmental problems that were understood as fish kills and noxious air pollution. But hazardous waste is a more abstract and complex problem. Because we don't have a sensory experience with the hazard, it's more insidious. It's more difficult to tie exposure to the pollution to the adverse health outcomes. And it required in the public consciousness a leap of abstraction to understand that the chemicals that they couldn't smell, couldn't see under many circumstances, buried in the ground, were still environmentally dangerous. By the time I finished school, it wasn't hazardous that was capturing the headlines and capturing the public imagination. It was stratospheric ozone depletion. These figures show the evolution of the ozone hole over Antarctica from 1981 to 1999. And this is heralded as one of our great environmental policy successes: global coordination, technological innovation, and the stratospheric ozone hole has been shrinking now for several years. But at the time I graduated in 1987 as a new environmental engineer, stratospheric ozone depletion was considered a crisis. Consider this: we've moved from pollution, with which we have the sensory experience, to abstraction, with which we can at least identify people who are suffering with leukemia, cancer, or other as a result of their exposure, to ozone depletion. Ozone depletion can still be measured directly, but only with specialized instruments. And the threat of ozone depletion requires another leap of abstraction in the public imagination to comprehend. Well, by the time I went back to grad school, it's nothing that can be measured directly. The salient environmental problem of the day is global warming, or climate change writ large, because some areas might cool and some areas might warm, but on the whole, the climate changing in unpredictable ways that can only be captured through modeling. Talk about another level of abstraction, the complexity in the system that requires the public to get their brain around global warming or climate change is even beyond that of ozone depletion. It can only be represented in a model, not in a direct measurement. We can measure weather, but we can't measure climate. And we certainly can't class climate without the model. So over my lifetime, the things that were happening to me as a child, whether it was a Lake Erie fish or whether it was pollution in the air in Pittsburgh, were not the environmental problem. Although they shaped my environmental ethic, they were not the environmental problems that I graduated into this world to tackle. Those problems are much more complex and abstract. This is Harlem Brundtland. It's 1987 when I graduate from my undergraduate, and people have now come to understand sustainability as a broad umbrella term that incorporates a number of environmental and economic concerns. And what I think is interesting is we've gone back to the idea that we need the economic growth that the pollution represented in 1943. Not saying people want the pollution, because our ideas about the environment and the economy are much more sophisticated, but we have yet to give up this idea that economic growth is one of the ways of making our lives better. That idea has increasingly been questioned because we are in a post-industrial age. The Pittsburgh that I was born into was an industrial city. The Pittsburgh that I've left is now in a post-industrial era. So what does that look like in popular culture? One of the formative cultural experiences of my youth was The Wizard of Oz. What I didn't know is that it was a cultural commentary in which the Tin Man represents the factory worker and the Scarecrow represents the farm worker. And the moral simplicity of The Wizard of Oz is illustrated as the good witch, the bad witch, and the innocent Dorothy. But it wasn't long ago, this is my daughter's favorite musical, that The Wizard of Oz was turned on its head. That we got a different moral perspective through the book and the musical play Wicked, that positions the Wicked Witch not as morally decrepit, but as a victim of her own circumstances, with her own story. It reverses the perspective on the popular story that came out in the movie at the end of the Depression. And it asks us to take a different moral view, to question our own values and the simplicity of the story about what is good, what is evil, and what exists in between. That level of sophistication that we are confronted with in the post-industrial age, and it's no accident that it emerged in academia about the same time as this new environmental ethic, and it's about the same time as Earth Day. This is a paper by C. West Churchman in Berkeley, and it is the first that I can find to coin this term wicked problems. Although the paper is by Churchman, you can see in the text that he attributes it immediately to Horst Riddle. It was Horst Riddle's seminar, in an academic seminar, much like this one, where he talked about wicked problems that Churchman thought was noteworthy enough to codify the term in the literature and popularize it through publication. This feature that stuck with Churchman, and he identified them as a moral issue, but the feature that stuck with him is this adjective wicked is supposed to describe the mischievous and even evil quality of these problems, where proposed solutions often turn out to be worse than the symptoms. Now, I don't think the problems are necessarily evil, but you can see how it ties back to the simplistic representation of good versus evil, and it's an appropriate way to recast the Wizard of Oz. The key element at the end of this paragraph is that the solutions to those problems that the Industrial Revolution solved give us new problems. This is the intellectual genesis of the Industrial Revolution, or if not the genesis, the representation. It's a picture of Frederick Winslow Taylor, who is probably the most influential engineer, and I'm an engineer, ever. More influential than Ford, the industrialist, more influential than the iPhone and Steve Jobs and Apple in this sense. Taylor changed the way we think about production and society. He wrote a book called Scientific Management, in which he purported to apply the scientific process to the measurement of manufacturing. He changed the incentive structures. He helped invent the assembly line and the separation of labor that led to economies of scale and made people rich. He wasn't the only one. Frank Gilbreth was another industrial engineer. They knew each other very well. They performed many of the same kinds of consulting tasks. And I was introduced as a boy to Frank Gilbreth by the book by a Dozen. Gilbreth had talked about economies of scale. He had a dozen children, and 3 of them wrote this book about growing up with an efficiency expert as a father. I thought the book was hilarious. It became a movie and a remake of a movie. Again, it entered popular culture. What Taylor could not have known is that the solution to starvation would give us obesity. The solution to infectious disease would give us super antibiotic resistant bacteria. That the solutions of the Industrial Revolution, material scarcity, well, the solution is mass production. But now, of course, we have the problem of pollution, of litter, of having no place to put the byproducts of mass productions. The solution to menial labor was fossil fuels and the internal combustion engine. But now the problem, of course, is climate change. Every solution that the Industrial Revolution was able to give us created a new post-industrial problem. And that is characteristic of wicked problems, where the solutions create new problems that often appear worse than I'm not saying they are, but often appear worse to the next generation that is forced to confront the increasingly complex new problem generated by the prior solution. This is Riddle's paper. He published it years after Churchman wrote an article about his seminar, in which he describes in greater detail the wicked problems and why they're important. He claims that science was developed to deal with tame problems, that science, as we understand it in our American universities, co-evolved with the Industrial Revolution to support their specialization of labor and their economies of scale. But where we are confronted with complexity, what Riddle calls the problems of social planning, or he calls it a general theory of planning, where we're confronted with social problems, interdisciplinary problems, problems that cannot be reduced, optimization, for example, of the line or the fact will lead us down the wrong course. He characterizes those problems, the wicked problems, as having 10 characteristics, but there's a lot of overlap, so I've grouped them into these 5 categories. Difficulties in problem formulation. You often don't know what the problem is, and when you formulate the problem, you simultaneously call to mind the solution. If I were to say, well, the problem of crime is that we have all these people running around without jobs, it simultaneously suggests that the solution is economic opportunity. But we could have formulated the problem in a different way. We could have formulated it as a failure of education. Wicked problems are difficult to formulate. And once you do, you simultaneously suggest the solution. The solutions will always be prescriptive. They will always require intervention. They will always require a change that disrupts the status quo. And you're never done. The open-ended time frames mean that the next generation is going to inherit your solution as a constraint. And because these solutions are value-laden, prescriptive, the next generation may or may not hold the same values as the previous generation, but they will be operating with those constraints. The wicked problems always have an element of novelty, and that means that we are vulnerable to surprise. The next thing that we experience will not be the same as the last one. Early in this hurricane season, there were 2 tropical storms, one of which became a serious hurricane. Both pointed at New Orleans in rapid succession. New Orleans and Eastern Texas are vulnerable to hurricanes, but there had never been 2 set up on the same pathway that would hit the same area, one right after another. We see the same thing in California wildfires. We know that wildfires are a thing and we know to expect them. We have never seen this magnitude, this many wildfires this early in the season. And we have every right to feel surprised by the new events that we're confronting. So why do we have wildfires? Well, one of the reasons is when you suppress the small fires, fuel builds up in the forest. And the perverse outcome that makes this a wicked problem is that fuel becomes available for even larger fires that cannot be suppressed. One of the things about complex systems is that the harder you try and get one thing, change one thing in the system, the more you will change all the other elements of the system that may reinforce the very thing that you wanted to change in the direction you didn't want. Finally, I've touched on no universal moral principles or ethical rules that apply to wicked problems. Competing and different value systems will apply. And this is, again, it is illustrated in the musical presentation of Wicked, where when you change the perspective, the problem and the solution changes as well. Drucker is really interesting because he's so famous as a management guru, but he's also interesting because he changed his mind towards the end of his career. His thinking was very much in line with Taylor. He used to think that there was one best way to perform the work. And when it came to manual labor or assembly line work, a strong case can be made that Taylor's way of thinking, of searching for the one best optimal way, was effective. But Drucker realized that as we transition from the Industrial Revolution to the knowledge revolution, there will not be one best way of doing or managing knowledge work. That there would be a multiplicity of ways. And this multiplicity, these multiple perspectives, multiple experiences is essential because the problems that we're dealing with now are wicked. So if not Taylor, what would we adopt as a way of thinking for these post-industrial problems? And I believe that it's embodied in Ed Catmull's book, Creating, where he talks about his career, and in particular, he focuses on Pixar. How does Pixar create value? What does Pixar do that is different? And here, the quality of the story, Catmull says, is paramount. That the technical wizardry of the animation is nowhere near as important as the quality of the ideas. Catmull would, I think, encourage us to be playful at those early stages where we're looking for the high quality ideas. And the irony is that Taylor's concept of the one best way occurred to him as a boy playing games. There has been a number of new books and scholarship looking at creativity and ideas, in addition to Catmull's, and I've just created a brief collage of them here. Stephen Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From and Pagan Kennedy's Inventology are typical. Johnson wrote another one about play and the way that games have made the modern world. And this lesser known one, How to Fly a Horse, does a good job of debunking the myth of the lone scientific genius. So these books present a new understanding and another cultural shift in how we think about knowledge. The old way of thinking about knowledge, and this goes back to Aristotle, is to organize it as a tree. This is consistent with the specialization of labor. I keep clicking when I try to move the video, and so that it doesn't wind up covering the screen. And I'm gonna give this one more shot. There we go. The tree model means that we reorganize knowledge along these disciplinary branches. And as more knowledge accumulates, we need more branches. We need limbs off the end of the branches. We need twigs off of the end of the limbs. It reduces every new PhD student to a leaf growing off a twig, some stationary place on the tree of knowledge. And this is the model of industrial revolution and the modern American university that has persisted throughout my entire lifetime in my career as a professor. There is a new model, and it's represented on the right. And we're familiar with a different metaphor for this model. It is the web. And of course, we surf the web, we use the web. It means the World Wide Web, but it's more extensive than that. When I started my career as a faculty member at Purdue University, there were still disciplinary libraries on campus. You could go to the engineering library, you could go to the humanities library, but nobody goes to the library. Nobody takes their physical being in this way. Now we use massive databases to search the entire body of public knowledge. It is easier than ever to connect different ideas. What the post-industrial age needs are PhD students who are more like spiders and less leaves. These students can draw the web between the different branches of specialization to make the connections that our previous authors, Johnson and Kennedy, say are essential to the creative process. So we notice this transition between P to web. And although it is just beginning in the universities, it is ubiquitous outside the university. And we wrote up an article and we published it in Nature Sustainability, giving some examples of how that change in the metaphor empowers us to be more creative about the solutions like water management that are relevant to the environment and sustainability. I like my Sharpie marker better than the graphic that Nature Sustainability did for us, but who am I to argue? They've represented the transition well enough. Why is it important? Because the creativity step, where the new ideas and connections come from, is essential to making what Thomas Kuhn would call the paradigm shift, for escaping from the industrial model of thinking and moving to a post-industrial model. This is a series of processes in knowledge organization, transfer, and sharing that was postulated by Nonaka. Nonaka was a scholar, a contemporary of Drucker's, a business scholar, who said there are 4 processes of knowledge sharing: socialization, which is about the idea sharing; externalization, which you make tacit knowledge of the experience and the idea more concrete with prototypes and blueprints and models; internalization, in which people have their own experience with your models and your prototypes; and combination, Taylor worked to the right, combining the parts and materials on the assembly, because combination will scale, but socialization will not. Socialization is where play happens. Socialization is where creativity takes place. And it is socialization that is the necessary step for making the paradigm shift. After we prove the ideas in the internalization, externalization loop, then we know what we have to scale and we can resort to combination. We can go back to Taylor. Taylor is not obsolete. He is insufficient for the problems of the post-industrial age. So what does socialization look like? Well, Riddle points us towards design thinking, which is something that exists within the arts, media, and engineering department at ASU. I'm using this book out of Stanford as an example. It's written for the lay perspective, and it encourages people to think of their lives and their intentions as a series of experiments from which they would learn. This is exactly the approach that Riddle recommends, because we are never able to solve wicked problems. We can only resolve them and resolve them. So we have to think in terms of experiments that will teach us new things, hypotheses that we test, and re-experimentation. I disagree with Riddle on one important point, and that is he says science was designed for tame problems. No, scientific institutions, the university were designed for those tame problems, but science is a process, not a thing. And science is amenable to wicked problems. Even this concept of reductionism is not something that we need to throw out altogether. We need to apply it where it belongs in this knowledge generation process. We can certainly come up with hypotheses that we test, that we inform, and re-hypothesize in this recursive way that is consistent with both design thinking and science. It is exactly the model that has become known as the lean startup, that is, if not popularized, if not originated, popularized at Stanford by people like Steve Blank. And it may be the way that we work our way through the problems of the post-industrial age. This is me now. It's about 46 years later, and I'm curious about your reactions and discussion, questions, comments.
So, as I said before, please feel free to raise your hands in the section, and I'll be able to unmute you so that you'll be able to chat as well. So Pavan does have a question.
Robert, are we also generating comments via YouTube?
Yes, and in fact, while Pavan is unmuting, Don Marinelli from YouTube says he's actually watching this from Pittsburgh himself. That's his home. And he's referenced Earth Day 1970 in his own presentation in the speaker series 2 weeks ago. So it seems like we've got a Pittsburgh thing going. Maybe you can commiserate about the Pirates with Don at some point as well. But in any case, Pavan does have a question.
Oh, get me started.
Pavan, you're muted again.
Hi. Hi, Tom. Nice to meet you again. I don't know, we met a long time ago. So, are you still there? Okay. So, this question of wicked problems at this level of abstraction, agreed, I mean, unsolvable. But how do you square away these sensibilities with the pragmatics? For example, use-inspired research, ASU, right? And impact, and those sorts of immediate goals. How do you square away the sensibility that you can't solve these problems in any real sense of the term, except to create new problems and you keep going? And David and I have had this conversation for 8 years. David gives me a hard time saying you can't solve problems. You don't wake up one day and say you want to solve problems. But we do as engineers, we wake up every day thinking to solve problems. So how do you square away these questions?
Thanks for this question. You're giving me an opportunity to editorialize, and I'm interested in reaction to this. We use the rhetoric of solutions and solution-oriented and use-inspired to a fault. We are, I'm going to say, especially in engineering, pathologically preoccupied with solution. And in a way, it's not our fault. It's the way we teach students. They come in and they take calculus and they take chemistry and they take all the physical science and mathematics courses. And we teach them that the problems we present are solutions. And by the way, the solutions to all the odd problems are in the back of the book, and there's one right solution. And if you don't get 90% of right, you will not get an A. Because of the way we teach, especially in the first 2 years, and especially in the physical sciences and engineering, we reinforce this mindset of one best, one right way, that problems come from a textbook or from a professor or from someone else in a position of authority, and solutions come from the back of the book. This impoverishes our imagination and our creativity. So every year in my class, Engineering Business Practices, the final lecture, the final exercise is this provocation. Where do problems come from? Because formulating the problem is just as important as exploring the solution. And we don't have anywhere near enough rhetoric, discussion, pedagogical intent around problem formulation. Imagine if you put on the side of the buses that transport students and people between campuses, instead of saying that we were solution inspired or solution, or we were problem oriented, it would sound very negative. And I can understand why it's not the public messaging, but in classrooms, students must have opportunities to practice formulating their own problems. During the last presidential election, we're in an election year, it's reminding us of the political contest. During the last presidential election, Trump talked about he's going to build a wall, and he signed an executive order authorizing for the wall. Some of my former students have been down to the border and are working on that wall. My students are civil engineers, and so they often work in the service of public projects. Who decided that was the right problem to solve? And I'm sorry to say that most of my former students don't have a clue. They don't know where problems get prioritized. They don't know how problems are formulated. Elon Musk says he wants to Mars. Where did that problem come from? Elon Musk's imagination. And now he's hired many of our students to solve his problems, the problems that he chose. We must rebalance, and Wicked Problems helps cause attention to this. We must rebalance educational emphasis and allow students to practice formulating problems. One of the objections to this idea is that students aren't going to be very good at it. Well, of course not. They don't have any practice. Let us start them in their naive state where they have difficulty formulating problems, and allow them to understand what makes a good problem and what makes a poorly formulated problem by thinking at it along the way. So that's partly a response to your problem. When it does come time for action, and Wicked Problems cannot be tested in the lab because we cannot model complex systems with all of the context. I'm not saying we shouldn't test in the lab. I'm saying the lab results are not definitive. They must be tested in the real world, and hopefully in small scale experiments where the negative consequences what they are. When it is time to act, then something I haven't talked about but complements Wicked Problems is the precautionary approach. The thing that we tend to do to reduce the statistical difficulty is express things as single point estimates. The average that. And it's not representative of the world of surprise. In the world of surprise, we must pay careful attention to the outliers, things that we never expected, that are so far from the average that they could skew the entire distribution. The precautionary principle asks us to pay attention to those things that we're not predicting, but might be possible, and to react to them as the possibility becomes our awareness. When we act in resolution of Wicked Problems, the precautionary principle is one of the essential ethics.
Thank you for that response, Tom. I believe Christy has a question as well.
Thanks, Robert. Hi, Thomas. That was very has been a very interesting conversation. I was listening in on YouTube and then decided I wanted to ask some questions. So the thing you brought up about abstraction earlier, with this way in which the problems have gone from visible things that we could potentially sense and engage with to these things that are so large that the average public, the average individual scientist even, is incapable of wrapping their mind around, really struck me. And I'm curious if you could speak with us about how we could train students to themselves deal with these questions of abstraction and communication with the public, because one of the failings I see with regards to climate science is the fact that there's been an absolute failing to communicate that this is an abstraction and why it's so critical that this is something that we have to engage with in an abstract manner.
Boy, that's tough. I have former students all over the world. Some of them are in Colorado and in touch with some of them periodically. And I got a note and it said, Dr. Seager, the parts of Colorado that aren't on fire are covered with snow right now. The experience that people are having, and it's a sensory experience and a cultural experience, is a way to make sense of the world. So Christy, I think you have a really good point about the challenge of climate science and climate change. You could make a case that climate scientists have failed to carry the message of the risks that exist in our atmosphere and the pace at which we are changing its chemical composition. I don't think that's a fair criticism, at least not all the time. There might be individual failures.
Mm-hmm.
Difficulty is not, sorry, go ahead, Christy.
Oh, I was just making an acknowledging noise.
Gotcha. The difficulty is that people don't make sense of data. Data is not information. Information is not knowledge. And knowledge is not wisdom. As scientists, we work typically with data and we try and turn it into information, and then we sort of organize it in a way that constitutes knowledge. And we rarely are qualified to impart wisdom. It is wisdom that is needed in action. And we will not reach a public or a decision maker with down at the bottom of this hierarchy of knowledge with data and information. The way that human beings are wired, they make sense of things in stories. And so in the public domain, it's not a matter just of science communication. It is a matter of competing narratives, some of which make more sense to some people because they resonate with their experience. That narrative resonates with their values. And the others don't make sense. To be more effective communicators as scientists, we need to be more effective storytellers. I'm a great admirer of Hans Rosling and the way that he does his animated graph, the development of different countries over decades. I think he's brilliant in the cartoons and the graphics, give an intuitive sense of the change in data over time. And I don't think that Hans is going to be effective either until it becomes a story that people have an emotional experience with. So part of the reason that I say, this is where I was born. This is the way my city has transitioned. This is the way the intellectual challenges, you know, what it was like when I was in elementary school and what it was like when I finished graduate school, because it makes it personal. It casts me as a character, but hopefully a character that people can identify with and say, I've struggled to understand this level of abstraction too, until you reduce it to a story that will relate with emotionally, that they can identify with through their own experiences. It will not move or convince them of anything.
I'm curious if then it's also a problem of scale. Like you brought us into this scale that's so personal. And when I talk with my dad about climate change, he says, he essentially says, you know, I'm kind of agnostic on this, but I do know that if we improve emissions on trucks, the air gets cleaner and people don't get sick as often. I can get behind that. And if it has impact on climate change, great. And so, you know, what might it mean to even take the stories then and make them on actionable bits of scale, even if you take those different puzzle pieces and together they become the scale of having impact on climate change?
This is a great point because the scale of the problems has expanded as the level of abstraction has gone up. Love Canal became a hazardous waste site, and there was Superfund legislation, and we thought that we could put pins on the map that would identify the locations that needed remediation, and that the problem would be confined to those locations. Stratospheric ozone depletion mentality, that there was a place that was clean and that there was a place that was contaminated. In stratospheric ozone depletion, there's really no boundary and it moves around. Now we're talking about the entire planet, and it seems somewhat futile. I don't know your dad, obviously. Mine. He's environmentally minded and yet politically conservative. It's a weird contradiction in the minds of some people, but he can also get like the precautionary principle. He can, for different reasons and holding different values, come to the same kind of conclusion or experiment or vision of what action we might take that I would have. Nonetheless, I've met people of my father's generation who are cynical, who are saying, haven't environmentalists had enough? Haven't, you got this one and you got that one and you got the other one. Do you have to take the whole planet? And the environmentalists would say, yes, that is the scale of the problem. But that doesn't speak to their concerns of kind of environmental overreach.
Thank you.
I think this is raising some interesting questions about who's telling the stories as well, because as you said, it's the questions of who's raising what is a problem is one point, but also who is telling the stories, who is shaping the narrative as well, and how does this relate to concepts of equitability and fairness, of people sharing and having different value systems as well, through cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, and other sorts of backgrounds as well. I'd like to comment on anything in that.
The Wizard of Oz was a story by Frank Baum, and it was written late in the century. It only popular at the end of the Depression when they made a movie starring Judy Garland. And Frank Baum, he wrote a series of books, but the Wizard of Oz, as it's encapsulated in the movie, ignored the social commentary that Frank Baum put into his writing. At the time, the future of America as rural or urban was still contested. And there are economic, geographic, and political tensions between those two areas. And Baum was using this metaphor of the characters in the story to try and help illustrate those. It's a story. Wicked is also a story. And it changes the perspective. It changes the character with whom we identify and with whom we're sympathetic by telling a story. So when my daughter came to me, it was 5 years ago, and she says, Dad, I don't know what to major. She's going to go to ASU. She's very good at math and science, but she loves the arts. I don't know what I should pick. I said, I think I do. I got a friend, David Tinapple, who teaches in the arts, media, and engineering program. He and I get along great. We have completely different, he talks about critique and all these crazy things that students are supposed to learn from one another. The right answers in the back of the book. But David and I, by exchanging these different perspectives, have formed a friendship that is creative and I've learned a lot from. I told my daughter, you should go study arts, media, and engineering. You should take every course that David Tinapple teaches. She did exactly that. You might have had her in one of your own courses, and along the way, she made 2 movies. She could have studied film, but that's not where she wanted to be. She wrote the screenplays and she met the other students that would allow her to tell her own story through the video. And we had some terrific exchanges about what makes a good story and what's compelling. I've become more curious about the arts and media part of your department and less curious about the engineering department, my own, because engineering is a normative discipline. It is the engineer that sees the desert and says, this is a beautiful desert. You got the cactus thing going there and you got a nice gully, but you know what we should do? We should pave all that and we should put in a Walmart. That's an engineer. It is our job to conform the world, things that only exist in imagination. because we are a design discipline. Artists are also designers, and it is media that captures this larger public imagination that may result in some kind of concurrence or permission to build that Walmart or that South Mountain Expressway or whatever the Roosevelt Dam, whatever the infrastructure is that the civil engineers have the technical knowledge to create. I'm very curious now about storytelling and narrative, particularly the competing narratives that we see playing out in this new information communication technology called social media.
You may want to be careful or you'll be increasing your friend David Tinapple's teaching load. David, are you raising your hand? Would you like to comment? Yeah, go ahead and unmute. Oops. Okay, now you should be able to unmute.
Gotcha. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Tom, and yeah, I'm curious about what you might think about just the language of wicked problems. I find the word wicked really interesting. I mean, interesting that it's framed that way, and I wonder if language itself might be part of the storytelling apparatus that fails us in even discussing wicked problems. Sort of in the sense that wicked problems could simply be problems. I mean, we have our language itself is structured in a very problem solution kind of structure, right? And maybe the existence of these problems where the solution is not actually a solution, it's just a shuffling of another problem. It's just kind of a movement of the problem, not really a solution of the. I wonder if the wicked problems are basically language's way of complaining that these don't fit the mold of problem. These break our conception of what a problem even, what the word even means, and that so maybe in the spirit of storytelling, we need new language for how to even describe these.
I think you're making a great point. You and I both know Dave Woods at the Ohio State University very well. And I was at the Naval Postgraduate School visiting a friend, and we were having a workshop, and I was in the unenviable position of following Dave Woods. So he's giving a talk, and I'm supposed to follow him up, and I'm supposed to be the guy that interprets it and relates it to civil engineering, blah, blah, blah. I think because you know Dave Woods, this is a hopeless task. Throughout everything that I had prepared, and I gave a talk on language instead. The gist of it is up on YouTube, which I got this from Neil Postman. Language is a technology for improving the quality of our thinking. When we use words, we invent words, the word symbolic representation of experiences, of things that we have no words to represent. And so I could say wicked, or I could say mug, and it creates in our mind the experience of the mug. If it's a good word and it's a word we understand, the word itself means nothing without this tacit context in which to interpret it. So once we understand that language is a technology for improving the quality of our thinking, we'd better understand this technology better. I broke it down for these are officers from all different branches of the military going to grad school. And I said, when we start with the English language, it is very linear in its thinking. Subject, verb, object. It lends itself to this cause-effect simplistic relationship. There is no way in the English language that the object acts back through the verb on the subject. The English language is missing the feedback loop that is inherent in complex systems and makes problems wicked. Without that language, without language doing the job of improving the quality of our thinking about complex systems, we must augment language. So what are our choices? Well, I use pictures. I use drawings, because on the drawing, I can represent the feedback loop, and they can be very simplistic drawings. But now I have the subject, I have the verb, maybe the verb is on the arrow, I have the object, and we know from at least Newtonian physics that the object must act back on the subject. We can draw these, they're simple, but they're complex. That is, they're uncomplicated diagrams of the system. Now we have two technologies for improving the quality of our thinking: language and drawing. So in my class engineering business practices, I frustrate the heck out of my students in a number of ways. And one of them is requiring them to draw graphs by hand, to draw sketches by hand, because I realize that my students don't have the experience that I had as a student. We don't take drawing, we don't teach drawing, it's expensive, and we're now in a digital world. I give my students instructions on drawing, they're very rudimentary. And I claim that learning how to draw will activate a different part of their brain that improves the quality of their thinking. I don't recall my daughter doing much drawing in your curriculum, but again, we have more than language as a technology. We have a whole series of creative arts that change and improve the way we think. We are not employing them, partly because language scales. Figures scale too. But not everything that we do that improves the quality of our thinking, for example, sculpture, will scale the way that language does.
So language, people have kind of a common vocabulary around things, and people ascribing meaning to these characters have the same ascribed meaning behind it as well. And I think that something interesting to think about is that once we bring data into the mix and the comprehension of understanding how data is formed, people have different viewpoints of this from mathematical perspectives, from computational perspectives, from statistical perspectives, and all kind of bringing and mixing that together. I think that it becomes interesting as well, because the same language that people use, the same words people use, have different perspectives and meanings that are associated with them. And I think that just grows the challenge even more. But I wanted to ask a point that's related kind of to that, and also related to the storytelling aspects that you're talking about as well. When it comes to scientific storytelling especially, there's some nature of what people would call dumbing it down for the general public, and simplifying things away so that it becomes more palatable for a wider audience. How do you feel about that? How do you strike the right balance about that? How do different people strike the right balance? Are they doing justice to the science behind it, or an injustice to science behind it, by storytelling through sorts of media where they maybe oversimplify, maybe undersimplify? What's your take on that?
I object to the phrase dumbing it down. I object because science must be approached with humility. The things we don't know by far exceed the things that we do. And science can't prove a dang thing except that some idea is wrong. So where am I going with this? When we say, well, I don't want to dumb it down, it suggests that we're in a hierarchy with the people that don't sit on our branch. This was, I'm going to paraphrase Michael Crow. It was shortly after I came to SU, and he was speaking up in Coeur d'Alene, and I flew up to Coeur d'Alene just so I could get to know my new university president. And he told a story that I'm going to butcher, but the point will survive my exaggeration. He said, you know, I go to talk to chemical engineering and they tell me the mechanical engineers don't know anything, that the chemical engineers are the real expert. And then I go over to chemical engineering and the chemical engineers tell me that the electrical engineers don't know anything. And the electrical engineers tell me the civil engineers don't know anything. The civil engineers tell me that the chemical engineers don't know anything. Evidently, I've got an entire school of engineering and nobody knows anything. It's true, because the things we know in this tree structure, they reside only on one branch. And there's a whole nother rest of the tree that we can't appreciate because we're not connected to. I mean, obviously it's an exaggeration. We know some things, but our knowledge is so incomplete that it fails to synthesize in a way that gives wisdom. Here's some wisdom. Every model is wrong, but some models are useful. And I'm not making that quote up, and I'm quoting. It is the humility of our model. Models are meant to abstract things away. Models are meant to oversimplify. The big advantage is that you pay attention to the things you really want to see. The big disadvantage is you lose context and you're subject to surprise because things are outside your vision. Science, The microscope is often used as a metaphor for science. And what the microscope does is focus, amplify your attention on the one thing you really want to see and subtract out everything else. Of course we dumb it down. That's what scientists do, is simplify, abstract, so that we can hopefully come up with some general principles. It sounds awful to say dumbing it down, but I think that's an awful thing to say. So I would rather maintain our humility. There was something else that you said at the beginning. I lost my thought on it, and it would probably come back to me in a way that makes me want to interrupt someone else.
Well, it's about perspectives, different perspectives on the same words, the same symbols that we use. And people sometimes ascribe the same meaning, and sometimes people will ascribe different meanings to it.
Thank you. That reminds me. There is every single research university in the United States is advertising positions in data science. Data is really cheap. The marginal cost of data is zero. But evidently, the marginal cost of data scientists on your faculty is like $100-something thousand a year. They're in very high demand. I don't feel a shortage of data. I have more data than when I was in grad school I ever could have possibly wanted. Data is not my problem. Wisdom is my problem. Knowledge is my problem. Information is my problem. And so the data scientist might be good at gathering the data and even organizing the data into information. The data scientist and the artificial intelligence machine, they're not going to give us wisdom. I haven't seen a single university advertising for a wisdom scientist. That's what's really in short supply right now. Wisdom doesn't make sense without the meaning making. And where does meaning making reside within the university? On what branch of the tree? It's not in engineering. It's not in physical sciences. It's in your liberal arts, your humanities, your artists, the people who are skilled at crafting stories that make sense of experiences.
Well, thank you for that, Thomas, and thanks for joining us today. I think we're just about out of time. So everyone else?
You go back to YouTube and find out did Daniel have a question or a comment?
No, I don't see anything on YouTube right now. We do have 15 people watching, but I don't see any other questions or comments there.
I'm all for a yay Pittsburgh, and if that's all that Daniel wanted to add, that's terrific. I highly recommend the incline that goes up Mount Washington. It gives you a great view, and it's a unique technological experience.
All right, I'm sure Don will take a look at that. Well, thank you for joining us, and for everyone else, we hope you'll join us again next week on the Digital Culture Speaker Series.